Welcome, everybody, to the Human Stack, a LinkedIn and YouTube live event. I'm Mark Nickerson. I'm really excited to be joined today by Phil Elson. I've known Phil for a number of years, since before I was a coach, working with people on developing their leadership and career trajectories. Phil and I met through a mutual acquaintance who may actually be in our live audience today. I think that's fantastic. And when I saw what he was doing now and developing the human stack, I really saw how applicable what he was doing is to some of the leadership challenges that I coach my clients to. It addresses problems that I saw live over a 30-year career in the tech industry, especially in engineering teams, but also any teams where you have tight deadlines and a fast pace, which is kind of the hallmark of the tech industry itself. So super thrilled that Phil was able to make this happen, to join me for this live event. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Phil to introduce himself a little bit more and talk a little bit about the human stack.
Thank you, Mark. Gosh, yeah, I've worked in tech now for about 17 years. I started off as a software engineer, then a senior software engineer. And for the last 5 years, I was working as a technical architect. And during that time, I had a bit of an injury, which I'll talk about later on. And that brought to my attention some of the health issues that we have at work and how they impact not just our health, but also our performance at work as well. And that's where the human stack kind of came from.
So, how does an injury turn into the human stack? And tell me a little bit more about how that got you thinking along the lines of, as humans, as part of, I mean, it sounds like when you say the human stack, I think of a software stack. So help me translate that from I had an injury to I have developed a new way of thinking about work, how we show up at work, how we work with our teams, and how we look out for each other within the human stack.
So it probably makes sense to start with the story of how I kind of got here. So there's two parts to this. One that I call a hardware issue, right? And 2009, I tore my Achilles. This was that injury that I've been talking about. And before that, I used to kayak and run. So I was quite healthy. And on a family holiday, on the last day, I just tore it. And I don't quite know what I did, but it took a long time for me to get rid of it. We went through COVID and had like a misdiagnosis of it, and I kept tearing it. And everyone knows an Achilles injury is not the best thing to have anyway. These tendons take a long time to heal. And for me, it just ended up taking multiple years. And during that, I put on weight. I got a lot of joint pain and developed gout. Because I had muscle atrophy in my leg, when I did start to get back to walking again, I ended up getting plantar fasciitis and heel bursitis. It was a bit of a roller coaster. And obviously for a lot of that, I could hardly walk. So it wasn't great, right? And I could see this was starting to impact my longevity. So yeah, thanks for sticking that longevity curve up there. And what this longevity curve shows, and a lot of people probably know what these look like anyway, is on the bottom we've got our lifespan, and on the top we've got a health span. And the best thing we can do really is try to maximize the area underneath that curve. It's kind of value, if you know what I mean, on life. The solid line is what kind of health is like for the average person with no intervention. The dashed line slightly to the right of that, with a kick out at the bottom, is the best medicine can do right now. I think Peter Attia coined that last bit there as the marginal decade, which is what a lot of us see at the moment where, unfortunately we're in nursing homes and with dementia. And obviously the goal is to kick it out as that dashed line is, which we're not going to be talking about any sort of longevity medicine like that. That's well out of the remit of this. We're talking about the basics here, but it's an interesting curve to look at. And do you mind going to the next slide now too? Yeah, thank you. So at this particular point in my life, I thought I was I'd fallen off the cliff. I'd hit the bottom and I was starting to rise up again, but things were taking so long, I didn't have much hope. And if kind of life or value is the area under the curve, you can see how it's been a bit diminished. So I was kind of at that point where I decided that I only had two ways to go. I could either just settle with what I've got, or I could try to find my way out of this. So being a software engineer at the time, one of the tools that we have is a bit of root cause analysis, right? So I did a bit of that on myself. I looked into a lot of the literature. I tested myself on foods. I cut out foods that were causing me joint pain. Then I looked into gout because I had that on my toes about how I would reduce that. And obviously that pointed me in the route of uric acid, and started me seeing that food is not just nutrition and the macronutrients and the micronutrients, but also it kind of signals our environment a bit. So I changed my diet. I cut out a lot of processed foods. And lo and behold, not only did my joint pain get better, and I wasn't even trying to do this at the time, I was trying to just fix that, but my weight dropped off. I lost about 34 kilograms in about 8 months, which was a nice added bonus. And then because I got my joint pain went away, my weight was coming off, I had the energy and the time then to exercise and build up my strength. And yes, the end of this journey is when I really started to see there's a misalignment between the food and things we have on the shelves and how it impacts our lives. But also that person I was between both of them was dramatically different. I was much happier, I had much more energy, I could show up better at work, and I had a lot more focus. So if you go now to the next slide, yeah, you're seeing how the longevity curve for me has changed. So I'm no longer aiming for that bottom row. This is my optimistic one now. I don't think I'll hit it, but we can always be optimistic, right? I feel like I've suffered enough with that vertical drop down. So, aiming for this. And I think what's interesting is while this whole thing is my journey through this, and it might look like it's anecdotal, when I was going through a lot of the research, and there is a lot out there, we'll do some show notes, something after this, where I'll link to a lot of it. We can see from the data out there that it's showing us that this misalignment with nutrition and exercise is linked to a lot of the diseases that we're seeing, cancer, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, metabolic syndrome and things. And when we look at work as well, the data there supports that not only is it linked to those diseases, but when we have the better diets in our bodies, essentially, we have better concentration. We have better attention, we're happier, etc. So it's a win-win to get this sorted. Not only do we fix our health, but we also help our performance.
So, healthy people, happy at work. I'm starting to see the connection there. Tell me a little bit more about kind of how you started to piece that together into something more systematic. Was this something that your colleagues noticed at work? Was it just something that you noticed in yourself? Explain a little bit more about kind of how that evolved from I'm eating better and feel better to no, there's actually a system here.
Yeah, so a lot of this particular point was really just me and my family noticing the big difference. And it did copy across a bit to work. And unfortunately, this particular time as well, I was starting to see at work that my stress levels were increasing, right? Which I think a lot of us have been through this, where the job gets more stressful. You end up having less motivation to do the things that you wanted to do, the exercise and eat well and things like that. And I didn't particularly like the person I was becoming when I came home. And so this took on the next step of the research too. I was looking through a bit more anthropology and evolution and seeing what we needed from that point of view. And then I could see it from when I was looking at that from my work lens, even though at the time I worked for a great company with great people, those lessons were kind of misaligned. So I was my job had changed a bit from what I originally had to what it now was, which has caused me a bit of stress and a bit of burnout. I had constant interruptions, which is the standard case in a tech world, right? So you didn't have much time to concentrate and flow. And when you're spread across multiple teams, across multiple geographies, and a lot of your time is spent being remote, it's really hard to build up those meaningful relationships and things. So both of these, this kind of hardware layer, which was my physical health at the start, and then going into this kind of software, more mental health side of things, was really interesting. It started to help me see those two sections. And you can see it here on the Maslow chart you put up, that we use Maslow in the human stack because it's quite well known to leadership, and it fits in with the research that we've been doing, and it's quite practical, right? And if we look at those two stories that I've gone through as well, and both of them have a lot of data that support them. The hardware side of it, physical side, the nutrition, the exercise, that's all in that physiological needs layer. And then the work side of things fits more into that, the top four, the software, if you will. So people haven't covered the Maslow's hierarchy of needs before. It's a motivational theory in psychology. And as you go up the tiers, it goes from more urgent needs into more kind of meaningful needs. So we start off at the physiological needs, go up to safety and security, love and belonging, self-esteem, and then self-actualization.
So that makes sense. And I like the fact that, especially for the tech industry, for folks that think about these things in a process-oriented sort of way, you've broken it down into hardware and software. In fact, I think most folks in modern society understand the basic differences between hardware and software. But help me kind of break this down a little bit further. I mean, when we talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we're talking about the basics of humanity. And I know in some of our conversations, you've talked about we're basically running the same hardware that we've been running for the last 200,000 years. So when I think about that and I go, okay, so Phil's focused on how do we make sure that we meet the physiological needs, that we're optimizing our health, but then also not just our physical health, our mental health. I'm trying to translate that 200,000-year-old caveman to working in an office setting with a computer. And I know we're not just cavemen with computers, unless, are we? I mean, how does this show up in a modern work environment when you take kind of these basic fundamentals and say, okay, now here's how we actually optimize for a work environment, for a team, or for an individual at work?
Yeah, you're right. So if we start off at that hardware level, those physiological needs, what I found interesting as I was going through the research is at work and by people in general, it's quite often ignored and overlooked. And that's because obviously in the Western world, we have food, right? We have water, we have shelter. We think those needs are implicitly met. But as I've alluded to before, if we have them misaligned, aka we're eating a lot of rubbish or we don't have enough sleep, that's hardware laid off those physiological needs to drastically change the trajectory of what that person looks like at home with their families and also the performance at work. So it's quite a critical one. And as you mentioned, a lot of the big reasons for this is the fact that we are 200,000-year-old human beings dropped into this kind of modern world that we are now, and we still need that sleep, the whole foods, the rest and recovery, the movement that we had. And because it's changed so fast in the last 200 years, our evolution just hasn't kept up with it. And one of the kind of downsides, I think, of being human is, take me for example, I was born in the 80s and I've never lived anywhere where I couldn't go into a supermarket and food was all in boxes or packets. So I don't really know any difference. To me, that's just the norm. But actually, that's not quite the norm. And as we're finding out with food and exercise and stuff, food signals the body it kind of indicates what the environment's like as well. And with exercise, we need it to not just build and maintain our bodies and minds, but we also need to exercise also to kick off some of the healing rituals, the healing mechanisms that we have. And it's also tied into a lot of those chronic diseases that we talked about before as well. It's misaligned. And then, so that's where we talk about those physiological needs, and the software ones above that. This same problem, the 200,000 year human that we have who evolved in tribes, we evolved to trust, to have belonging, to have rituals, some traditions, time for fun and have a bit of play and all this kind of stuff. And when we don't have that, we don't have the time for autonomy and work towards mastering things, that starts to create this disengagement and the presenteeism we're seeing. And it starts to build stress. And then over time, that stress, as we know, turns into chronic stress, which is then linked again to all the chronic disease that we're seeing at a time, links to our performance, and eventually to burnout. But then if we do have it the other way, then teams are awesome. People raise questions, you have great discussions. Some of the armor drops down and it feels a bit like home.
So tell me a little bit more about stress, because there's a certain body of study that says you need stress, that you can't exist without it, that without stress, your life gets measurably worse, actually, that stress responses are a good thing. If you think about it in terms of like physical therapy, you build muscle, you rebuild and regenerate tissue through measured stress. So how does that apply in a modern workplace where we know that there's a lot of stress, that there is stress all the time? How does that show up?
I think you probably go to the next slide, I think, Mark, if you like. Yeah, stress is a bit of a U-shaped curve, from my understanding, like this, where we have performance on the vertical and the stress level across the horizontal. And when we're understimulated or bored, we're kind of in that blue zone, right? When we're stimulated and we're enjoying what we're doing, we're in that and the yellow zone. And as we get overstressed and then super stressed, we go down the other side into the red. And what the data shows is that a lot of tech teams are sat where I've drawn that box. So we're sat in stress, and we're sat in stress, not just acutely, which is what we kind of evolved to have stress for, to evade that predator in that short time, or maybe a couple of days of like bad weather or something, but not day in, day out, consistent chronic stress, which, as we know, is linked to those chronic diseases and also exacerbated by the misalignment of that first layer. And when we're super stressed, like tech teams are, it's kind of shooting the business as well in the foot, because when for a knowledge worker, a creative person, a software engineer, or in those in kind of aligned industries, when we're stressed like this, our creativity goes down, right? We're in survival mode. Our decision-making goes down because, again, we're in survival mode. We just want to get away from this predator. And because of that, and it also applies to leadership as well, when their decision quality goes down, that impacts not just the team below them and their people, but depending on where that leader sits, that those decisions that are made more out of stress can impact stakeholders, customers, etc. And we've seen over the years, and I think we've got another slide for this as well, about the decrease in longevity of companies. Yeah, exactly. So from the 1970s, we have this shareholder primacy thing which came about, and it was slightly misinterpreted and dropped off the additional stakeholder kind of clauses from it. And a lot of the ramifications from that have been that while quarterly targets and stuff like that have been important, they have been at the detriment of the longevity of the businesses, as we can see here. Like the S&P 500, back in 1920s, the lifespan was 67 years, and it's 15 years today. And the UK is difficult to find the exact data because it's not quite as well recorded, but it looks very similar. So while these quarterlies are looking really, really good and great for shareholders, they're not being great for longevity of the businesses as a whole. And obviously, they've not been great for employee health and stuff either.
So when we talk about the impact on employee health, and I'm going to move to your next slide here, because this is one of the things that absolutely fascinated me. You talked about how having a full-time job and working for a company actually lowers the peak on that longevity curve. And I mean, my initial thought was, okay, great. So none of us should have jobs. Obviously, that's not practical. We need to work. So, how do you then go about translating that work stress into something that is more akin to the peak instead of all the way down where you showed that tech team box on the stress curve, which quite frankly is where I was used to living for most of my career in the tech industry. How do we address this if we say, okay, your longevity curve from work is going to be automatically flattened a little bit?
Yeah, so I've shrunk this curve down a bit because, as we know, we have a lot of chronic stress and stuff from work. And that has obviously increases our risk of those chronic diseases, but naturally brings it down. And the stress curve that we had from it is also exacerbated, like we talked about, from the physiological layer as well. And when work is misaligned, and as that continues to happen, it's going to draw it in even further, right? So it's going to get even lower. But then when work is health promoting, so it meets those layers of Maslow's hierarchy, so to speak. So we have more kind of tribes, if you know, at work, and we have those foundations of good health. And so good food is there, people are aware of the knowledge, they're exercising, you know, that we've got good teams, we've got leadership where they have trust. All these bits create a safe environment. And as we've seen from, I think, Google's Project Aristotle, that psychological safety is one of the big factors there. So once we have all this in place, it naturally starts to push the curve out again. People start to be healthier, and that echoes in the people they take home, the performance they have at work, and their longevity, but also that will echo out to other stakeholders as well that the business is talking to.
And I like the fact that you talked about it echoes outside of work as well. Because when we're talking about a longevity curve, we're talking about a human lifespan as well as the quality of life within it. And
Mhm.
yeah, everyone wants to feel good and be productive at work, but ultimately, I think most of us want to also feel good and be productive outside of work, pursue our hobbies, spend time with our families. And so as you talk about expanding that longevity curve, what does that look like practically? How do you do this within the human stack? Where does this go from, hey, Phil's got a nice theory that if you feel better at work, you're going to do better work, into how do you measure that? How do you tease a signal out of that you can share with leadership? How do you make different decisions? What kind of decisions do you make? Walk me through kind of the not just the so what, but the what next part of this.
Okay, so I guess now it makes sense to jump into the kind of human stack architecture, if you will. So yeah, thank you. So the human stack really is a methodology and set of tools that's designed to give leadership visibility into their teams. So it's proactive and it's to help people perform at their natural best. And we've broken it up into this section. So you'll probably notice that there's Maslow's hierarchy of needs in there too, and it's split across the three columns, which are individual, team, and leadership. So when we look at the individual, we're looking at how they are performing and how they're feeling across those five tiers, right? As we go to the team, it's how they're operating collectively across those five tiers as well. And then as we go to leadership, so at the moment from individual to team, it's kind of going in the right direction, right, towards leadership. And at the leadership tier, it's about their decisions and then how they impact those tiers going down. If that makes sense.
It does, makes perfect sense.
So I think the next thing to probably talk about then is the first part of this human stack architecture, which is the foundational knowledge piece. So we talked quite a lot about, you know, my first story, the hardware piece, and how when we get this right at work, it adds to people's health, but also their performance. And at the moment, a lot of people think that while they have this physiological needs bit sorted because we have food and that sort of stuff out there, when we get it wrong, it can have a lot of consequences to our health and also performance at work. So this piece is really about getting shared knowledge and the language across the individuals and the teams and up to leadership. So everyone's on the same playing field. Everyone knows what kind of exercise looks like and why it's important. Everyone knows what good nutrition looks like and why it's important, why sleep is important. It's those very basics. There's nothing rocket science in here. But if we get that consistent language across, then it helps not only people be healthy, but it also helps when the leadership want to make decisions which impact that physiological layer, that they have the foundations, that the knowledge is going to be there. People are going to understand a bit more why they might be doing your morning scrum, might be not just a stand up, but you might be going out for a walk and doing it, for instance. Or a lot of companies do these fruits and bits of that anyway, but that's the general idea.
So I really like the idea that there are intentional decisions that leaders can make to help promote that physical health, that physiological health, everything, like you said, from stand up and walking meetings to what foods are available in the break room. That makes perfect sense. Translate it a step further for me. Where do we go from there?
Okay, so this part, it's going to be in the next couple of weeks, we're going to release this. So this will be the knowledge for this will be free. So open source, if you will, if you're from the software world. And if organizations want to know that the people that have taken part in the courses, then we'll have an affordable course that they can do as well, just so people can get that tick box. So if you want, you should have the QR code if you're good to share that. So people can register. Thank you very much. If you scan that, you can register for updates when we make this live.
Fantastic. So that snapshot being open source, if you will, what's the secret sauce that you're bringing to the table there?
Okay, so the snapshot side of things is the bread and butter of the human stack architecture. So this is a snapshot of the individuals across those 5 tiers of Maslow and aggregated across the team and anonymized. So when it gets to leadership, people, they have the data, but they don't quite know who it's come from. And that helps give us more accurate information. People aren't worried about the consequences of telling the truth, so to speak. There's no political problems there. So that's the whole point of this. And it gives leadership visibility into how the teams are performing. And within each of the snapshots that we get, it's basically a survey where we explode each of these levels into multiple questions, which help us eke out where the problems lie. And then we aggregate them into, it's done on a Likert scale, but then we put it into red, amber, and green for each part. So then we can do the traffic light system within the report to say what each question is kind of flagging at and what it looks like for the overall level of Maslow. And then we can look at what remedial actions can be taken to fix that. That makes sense. And that can take a couple of flavors. That can be leadership taking ownership of the change if it's only minor, or that can be training from us with buy-in from the teams. And then I think a snapshot is great as a point in time reference, but then you also want to have it longitudinally right over time. And that's where we have the next service, which is like the pulse side of things, which is a set cadence based. Mark, you can stay on the previous slide for a bit. Yeah, so we have pulse, which is snapshots just over time, really. So then we track deltas, and we're going to be making the framework for this public as well, so people can use it, because our whole thing is trying to help as many teams as we can and how many people we can be healthy. And part of that is making this public, right? So the paid side of it, you obviously get the bonus of having the aggregation and anonymous data side of things. And on top of that, you get an external perspective. We'll have no kind of political issues with working inside the organization. We'll do the aggregated report as well for leadership. and there's a couple of follow-up calls, and you obviously get continuity as well with that. And then with the pulse side of things too, it will go into longitudinal data and the delta analysis. But at the moment, it's worth mentioning that these snapshots, which I think are really valuable, we're in a kind of pilot scheme at the moment. So if people are interested to be early adopters with this, I think Mike, you've got another QR code to register for that one. And yeah, feel free to set up a call or sign up for early access when it comes out. At the moment, we've got 2 slots left for April, and we've got 3 slots left for May for snapshots. So yeah, that'd be great.
I love that you've got a beta test going for 1,000-year-old hardware. I think that's pretty creative of you. I like it. And actually, this is something that when I think about the teams that I have worked on, there's all kinds of anonymous feedback surveys and things like that take place all the time. The fact that you're taking this to that next level of, okay, so we're not just going to take a quick sanity check on how the team is feeling right now, but we're going to actually start turning that into when and where we can make different decisions that impact not just the physical health, but the mental health of our teams, how we can reduce that stress, get it back to that optimal level so that you actually are able to perform at your peak. Like you described for yourself, when you started to take better care of your physical health, when you were able to start seeing some of those gains, or in your case, some of those losses, 35 kilos, that it enabled you to show up, make better decisions. And I think about that as a business leader. And I think about the fact that a team member who is making better decisions, who isn't feeling as much stress, has more time. It doesn't necessarily mean expand deadlines for everybody or anything, but when they're optimized around a healthy environment and they have that sense of psychological safety and they're able to remove some of those stressors, that has a direct impact to the bottom line of the company that isn't necessarily intuitive or obvious. But if you think about shipping code that needs fewer patches, that needs fewer updates, that you can take more pride in because you know you got it right the first time. You weren't rushed and just slapping something together to get it out the door. Those are all things that have measurable business impact to the bottom line of the company in terms of customer experience, in terms of product quality, in terms of brand reputation. Those are all really big things. And so yeah, on the one hand, I think a lot of people could look at the human stack and go, oh, it's just about feel better at work. But no, it's actually about do better work as well, provide more value to the company, provide more value as a company. And I think that's the part that really resonated with me as a leadership coach, as someone who talks about needing better leaders in the world in general, but also about how people can take ownership of their career, how they can grow and advance, and how they can do that through corporate environments. It's not all about get away from corporate environments because they're going to make you sick. It's about no, there are actually ways that you can optimize this and that you can do better things. So that I love that piece of this, Phil.
Yeah, cool. So like a big part of that, I think, is at the moment that there doesn't seem to be any real visibility into teams like this. That makes sense. So like a leader with something like this in place with a snapshot really gets that insight into where their teams are struggling and can fix it in real time before the performance starts to go downhill, which, as you said, costs them a lot of money. Where if you stay on top of it, fix it, keep people healthy, happy, the bottom line stays up, performance stays up at a nice, healthy level. And that's a win-win.
Shall I jump
We could
onto your next
probably,
project?
yeah, go for it.
All right.
Cool. So we've gone through the foundational knowledge piece, which is across those 3 at the bottom. We've then looked at the snapshot and pulse, which is about taking the data across the teams and the individuals and sending up to leadership so we can keep teams being healthy, as we've discussed, and keep performance at a good, healthy level. And the leadership decision framework, which again, we're going to completely open source this in a couple of weeks' time. This basically flips in a way the survey in a way that we had from the snapshot. And the idea of this is when we have a leadership decision that they think is going to be quite profound on their teams, they can run it through the leadership decision framework. And say if you went through the safety layer, it will ask them questions about how it might impact the teams at that level or the teams in their belonging say level as well. So before they even send this change out, they have a good idea of how it's going to impact teams and how it's going to impact individuals, and then they can do some impact minimization tasks as well, which will be shown through that flow, if that makes sense. So we've got this kind of in draft mode at the moment, and I think you've got another QR code as well you can put up so people can sign up for this one, and we'll let people know when this is up. And another big reason for making all this kind of public is to encourage improvement, right? We're going to be putting this out there. People have got better ways of doing it and stuff too. We'd love to hear. But the whole thing is about making people healthier, more performant at work, and just helping everyone out in general. So that'd be great.
So I love that you're providing so much of this for free. That's a big piece of what I do as well on my website with my leaders library, making sure that there's a baseline out there of content and information that people can use to make better decisions, to change how they show up at work. What's the next logical step for you in terms of, okay, great, we've got the QR codes up, someone can go and download some of these things. What's the next step as far as engaging with you in implementing the human stack in their work environment?
Okay, so actually, one thing I actually missed, Mark, is if you just go to the next slide as well, I'll quickly finish this one off.
Yeah.
So that leadership decision framework, I think, becomes really useful when we have them all together, right? So we have a leadership decision framework. You'd make a decision, you minimize the impact through the tiers that it has in there. And then that boils down to the teams and individuals. And then a couple of months later, right, you do a snapshot. And then the data gets aggregated back up to leadership, and they can see whether or not their kind of remedial action that they took to minimize the impact was working well enough. And if it wasn't, then they can tweak it for the next time. So we get a nice feedback loop here, which is a common thing to have in software engineering and other settings, but it doesn't seem to be the case so far in the human layer or the human stack, should we say. So hopefully this can help fill that gap.
I love that it's a continuous learning loop as well there, that you don't just implement a change, hope that, I don't know, more bananas in the break room does the trick and we're off to the races now. Problem solved, move on to the next thing. That it's something that you can actually implement over time in continuity, that you can be looking back at what has changed, how much of an impact did it have, what can you learn from that, and what might you do differently the next time, or what you might add into the framework over time. So that continuous learning loop, I think, is really a useful part of what you're doing here. It's not just a vertical stack, it's as you said, it's a true feedback loop.
I think going back to what you asked before I jumped in with this bit, if people want to message me on LinkedIn, that's probably the fastest way to get hold of me. And we have some links to the website. And for the human stack side of things, in the moment where for the human stack snapshots, should I say, we'll set up some calls and go through whether or not it's a good fit for them and how we move forward on a one-to-one basis, really.
All right. That sounds fantastic. I'm going to open it up. If anybody has questions that you want to put in the chat there live, please, by all means, go ahead and do so. I know that while we're waiting on anything there were a couple of questions that I had gotten from people who registered, including a couple of people that said that they wouldn't be able to attend live, but we're going to be watching the recording. So if you don't mind, I'm going to jump in and ask a couple of those questions and make sure that their questions get addressed up front here while we wait for anything from the live audience. The first question was, how can you prove that this works? Intuitively, it makes sense. Eat better, exercise more, have less stress. What could possibly be wrong with that? But how do you prove that this is something that's actually viable at a team scale? How do you prove that out?
So I think the science is quite well known. We have a lot of data on it, but it's part of the reason why we're keeping the snapshot at the moment in the pilot program so we can make sure that the surveys that we're doing and the one-on-ones end up with the data that we're expecting so that the reports and the actions that we're getting from them are accurate. So that's how we're doing it at the moment. And once we have that evidence in place, then we'll make it public.
Okay. That the snapshot, the surveys, this actually leads to something that I'll fully admit, Phil, the first time I saw you post about the human stack, my thought was, oh, it's just another engagement survey. How tuned in are your people? Which can be very useful. I know that a lot of companies use voice of the workforce type surveys to understand kind of overall sentiment, how the culture is evolving over time, and then make different decisions to actually promote better culture and get people more engaged. So I don't mean to minimize engagement surveys, but how is this different from the 1,001 engagement surveys that people take at work already?
Yeah, I think they fit different needs, right? I think the engagement surveys is still valuable and still should be there. The snapshot is more proactive. They're longitudinal in that they're of a shorter cadence, and they're not at the organization level. They go down to the individual teams, and that's where the data is aggregated at. So you don't lose the resolution, if that makes sense. So I think
Yeah,
that's
that makes
probably what
perfect.
the main difference is. And
Okay.
also, the data that we get from them is then used to improve the environment within those particular teams. Because one thing that's, I think, quite interesting and often missed is we're all different people, right? We're all individuals. And even if you've got a software house of, say, 5 Scrum teams all doing the same discipline, they're all going to have slightly different microcultures because everyone in them is different. And they could have completely different results in the same overall culture. Their mini cultures could have some toxic people in some of them, really throwing the results out. Does that make sense? So by having it at this finer resolution, you can deal with them before the A players and those teams decide to leave, for instance.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense because I've seen it said culture starts at the top of the organization. It's modeled by what the C-suite is doing. And that's your baseline culture that incorporates the entire company. But you're absolutely right. Different teams within even the same department can feel very different, can have different cultural norms, different ways of engaging. It's bands within tribes, within organizations, if you will.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
so that makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah, I think like when we get down to that level too, I think it's quite nice when we start to see businesses where, and I've been part of some of these teams where they have individual names for the individual scrum teams as part of a project. It just makes you feel a part of something unique, right? And people start to add in their own silly rituals in those little scrum teams and stuff. It's a little bit of magic that makes them kind of awesome places to be.
I love that. I love seeing that individuality not only able to show up, but actively encouraged. So leaders who lean into this, who create the, as you said, silly little team names or invest in end of cycle or end of sprint rituals to help people gel as an organization, gel as a team. I think that's really honestly one of the most powerful things that leaders can do, that managers can do, and that even if you're a little bit of a cynic, which maybe some people have accused me of in the past, I think when you see those things and you participate in them, even if you're coming at it with a little bit of a side eye, it makes a difference. Being part of that cultural norm, being part of that band or a part of that tribe, psychologically, it does something just in terms of your willingness to show up, your willingness to take risks, to try different things. So That then leads me to the question that I think comes straight from the heart of where I live and breathe around leadership coaching and career development, career advancement. Someone goes off and does this snapshot. What if the results are really uncomfortable for the leader? Because I've been on teams where that voice of the workforce information comes back and the leader isn't happy about what the team has had to say. They might take it a little bit personally. So when the results are maybe a little bit uncomfortable, what then? How do you work with that?
I think you say it comes up in that health of the workplace surveys too, and we're probably going to see more of that potentially happening with these surveys just because of that anonymous layer. And the questions in the surveys that we have on the snapshot can definitely point that way. And my take on it is it's better to know about them and fix them, even if they're difficult, than it is maybe to have a bit of confirmation bias thinking that you're epic. It's better to learn and become a better leader with the feedback from your team. And then you can make those changes, right? And then hopefully the next time around the results get better.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more. Anytime you can get feedback, whether it's constructive or whether it's complimentary, being able to take that and turn it into an action plan, to separate the ego from it, to separate the bias of, oh, this is something that my people have done against me, or it makes me look bad. It only makes you look bad if you don't do anything about it. So fully agreed with the idea that as you gain that knowledge and you have visibility to what some of the challenges are, you can do something about it. And I mean, the reality is we're all people and you want to treat people kindly. You want to do the right thing. And so if you find out that things that you've done or the way that the culture has evolved on your team isn't as supportive as you might have imagined it to be, it gives you an opportunity to go do something a little bit different there. And really, that that to me is what leadership is all about. It's understanding not just where you're trying to go, but how the people who are following you on that mission, on that drive, on that direction are able to keep up. Are they struggling? Are they doing okay? Whether you view that as servant leadership or as a steward, whether you view that as being a change catalyst, that's the important part of being a leader is understanding the environment, understanding the direction that you're trying to go, and understanding the people who are going to help you get there. So
Yeah.
with that, I know we're down to our last 5 minutes. I appreciate everyone who joined us today. We will make sure that the recording here is posted to the event site shortly. If you have further questions, reach out to me directly, reach out to Phil. I know we'd be more than happy to talk about how the human stack shows up. Phil, I'm going to ask you for copies of some of the material. I'm going to want to post this in my leadership library so people can find it there as well as on your site.
Awesome. Sounds
and
good.
with that, I'm going to give the last word to you to wrap us up and take us home there. So take it away, Phil.
Cool. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you everyone for your time and thank you, Mark. I hope you found it interesting. Feedback on this is very much welcome. As I said, you can message me through LinkedIn. That would be great. And yeah, hopefully you've seen that we've got a nice bi-directional kind of framework here, which will help leaders lead with a bit more visibility in a proactive way, which will help build health and natural performance with their teams. So on that note, thank you everyone for your time.